So thank you very much for joining, and welcome to Learning Redefined, Showbie's first ever conference celebrating teaching and learning. I'm Graham Trick, the learning specialist here at Showbie. And for those who've not met Showbie before, we're the hybrid learning platform that's empowering over 3 million users globally. And we aim to provide richer, deeper, more personalized feedback and assessment to all learners. So something we're proud about doing for almost 10 years. If you want to find out more, you can visit us at showbie.com. During the presentations, please use the Q&A feature to ask questions as they come to mind, and we will answer them at the end of Andy's presentation. So for now, I'd like to welcome Andy Brady to this session, and it's going to be based on meeting and supporting the English classroom with technology. So over to you, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Hope that you find the session interesting. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen, which would be a good start. Here we go. Okay, so as Graham says, we're going to be talking about supporting an English class with technology today. Just a bit of an introduction about myself, really. I'm the head teacher of Chelford CE Primary School in Cheshire. I have led the successful deployment of one-to-one iPad at 2 rural Cheshire primary schools, so that's Netheralder Primary School and obviously Chelford, where I'm at the moment. And then in 2019, I was invited to join the Cheshire East Key Stage 2 writing moderator team, and that was on the back of being moderated myself, or my children's work being moderated in 2018. So go and choose that experience to feed into today's presentation, which we're going to concentrate on writing. Now, the starting point I'd like to go through, whenever I tend to look at school improvement and change in leadership, is I'm quite a big fan of Simon Sinek's work around start with why, and there's a good TED talk and things I'm sure that many of you will have seen. If you've not seen them before, I would definitely recommend that you look them up. But basically, this is a model that looks at 3 different aspects of leadership change, and those being what, the how, and the why. And in his book and in his talk, he talks about that many companies start with the what, and that's what they want to do and what they want to be, and all this. And by doing this, they quite often lose sight of the bigger picture. I want to talk about this to start off the presentation is because I want to try to encourage people not to get drawn into the what. So in terms of when we're talking about writing, the what would be things like the results and the data and the stats and things like that you know you may be talking about. So in terms of school development, you know, for me, getting more greater depth writers or getting a high proportion of children meeting the standard, that isn't a target. Okay, that's a consequence of doing some good work and a consequence of having some good systems in place. So we try not to look too much at the what. Obviously, it's important. You know, those are the measures that we're accountable for, but that's not our main focus. So it talks about the how is almost like your unique selling point. It's what you do differently. It's the way that you deliver your why and what helps you to achieve your what, if you like. So when we're talking about how today, we'll be talking about the use of technology and how that can enhance teaching and learning through the context of writing. So it does play a big part in terms of how we plan forward. But the most important thing is to always look at the why. And Sint says you should always start with the why. And if you get your why right, and then you work out how you're going to meet that why, then the what, the results and things will all look after themselves. And quite simply, when we're thinking about children and we're thinking about their writing, we need to think about what's the most important thing. Now, the most important thing isn't the data. You know, the data is what the data will be. That's obvious. But for me as a school leader and as a teacher and as a parent, what I want my children to be able to do is to be engaged with their writing, to be inspired to produce some great writing, often writing that they didn't think they were even capable of doing. And also for the writing to be fun. There's no great secret. We know that when children are engaged and inspired to learn, when the learning is fun, then not only are they going to do a better job of it, but they're going to get, you know, they're going to really be inspired by that. Our saying is very much the case of happy children learn best. So it's important to bear that in mind. So please check out Sinet's work on the TED Talk, read the book. If you're like me and you're not a particularly great reader, I get it on Audible, just whack it in the car, but some good messages in there for us. So when we talk about, I want to start by talking about the writing process. And before we go on to talk about the impact of technology, it's important to just put out there that good writing is good writing. You know, you can have great learning without technology, okay? But it does add to the experience for the children and for the staff as well. So if you've got an interest in looking at how technology can enhance learning, I'd recommend that you look up something called the SAMR model. It's SAMR, and that will talk about how you can use technology to redefine some of the things that you do in the classroom, okay? So in my experience, and I'm only talking from my experience, I am by no means an oracle when it comes to this kind of stuff. You may sit there and completely disagree with everything I say, which is absolutely fine, no problem with, but I'll just share with you some of the things that I've come across in my experience. That great writing starts with reading. It starts with that immersion, access to high quality text. And that could be anything. It's not just narrative. It could be an explanation text. It could be a diary. It could be a poem. But unless children have an opportunity to see what the standard is that we're hoping for them to achieve and know what that looks like and be able to incorporate those features into their work, then they're not going to be able to do it. They're not going to be able to be gifted writers through osmosis. It's by having access to these high quality exemplar texts. Part of that process then is the discrete teaching of skills in order to prepare them for their composition. So for example, if I'm teaching an explanation text, I know that I'm going to need to equip the children with the skills that they're going to need to be able to show in their composition. So whether that's the use of formal or subject-specific language, whether that's the use of the passive voice, multi-clause sentences to add cohesion, all these different skills I'm going to want the children to be practicing in order for them to then adopt these techniques into their own independent writing. And that's where the composition comes into effect, where they're applying the skills in a creative manner, which is independent, because we want the children to be able to produce work on their own, which we'll be able to put towards our assessment at the end of the year. But we need for them to have practiced the skills in order for them to be able to use them in these compositions. And then finally, it's this idea of refinement and drafting and editing and reworking and publishing their work. So their final draft really kind of captures the full capability of their skills. Now, this writing process, you can do it without ever touching a bit of technology. Okay, what I'm here today to talk to you about is how we can use technology to perhaps enhance these different experiences that the children have along this way. We're going to unpick a couple of these things in a bit more detail. Okay, so in terms of immersion and giving children access to higher quality text, one of the ways in which I've used Showbie, and I'm not going to go through all the features of Showbie today because quite honestly, there wouldn't be time to do that. I'm sure that Graham would be able to point you in that direction. But I use Showbie pretty much in all my lessons. One of the ways is by giving children access to high quality text. So this was an explanation text that I shared with my pupils with a view to them being able to identify the features. Now, the way that I would do this normally is I would produce the exemplar text because I want to be able to model greater depth writing for my greater depth children, so they can really kind of get into that text and find out what structures and things that they can mimic and learn from. So I gave them this. This particular text was the children were going to write an explanation text about the circulatory system. So I gave them different subjects, but the same kind of text type for them to explore. Now, in this particular instance, I just shared it in Showbie, and the task was for the children to use what they know about explanation text to annotate where they think the features are, thinking about what they know about the assessment framework and make comments. So wherever you see the pink text here, this is where the child has had to go annotating this text. So this isn't really vastly different to what you might do if you gave children a worksheet and they stuck it in the book and they're writing around it. But one of the things that I could have done here in Showbie, instead of just giving them a task to look through the features themselves, I could put voice tabs on this worksheet and I could give them instructions, or I could give them explanations myself. So I could put a voice tab on this introduction and actually say, this is the introduction. The aim of the introduction is to be able to introduce the reader to what the text is going to be about. You will notice particularly what I've done in this introduction is made sure that I've got longer sentences with multiple clauses and that I've used commas to mark those clauses appropriately. That's because that's one of the styles of an explanation text. So you can actually add voice notes to the resource for them to use. I chose not to do this on this task, but what I did do, the child then submitted, they did the purple bits, they submitted that to me, and then I was able to mark it and provide feedback just by typing a couple of notes here. Again, I could have put a voice note there to say, can you find examples of the passive voice in this book? So if there's something that the child's not really understood and I wanted to dig down a bit further, I can put a voice note and I can start a conversation with that child. And I wouldn't be able to do that using traditional methods. I wouldn't be able to write down everything. It just isn't the time in the day to be able to do that. So you can already start to see some of the benefits. There's no photocopying. I'm not wasting time at the photocopier, not wasting resources. It's just a really nice workflow. The child downloads it from Showbie, works into the document, uploads it to me. I give them the feedback, and then they go on and they use that feedback to improve their work. In terms of going on to look at systematic skills development, again, the things that we're talking about here is we're going to model some of these skills. So whether it be, if we take the example of looking at the passive and active voice, we're wanting the children to have practice in doing that and changing these different sentences and exploring it for themselves. And then with the view that when they come to apply these skills in their compositions and then refine them, then they're going to be able to make use of these different skills. Now, again, we can do this process without the use of technology, but there are certainly some benefits that by using tech and by using Showbie in particular as your workflow app, that you can get some added benefits here. Okay, so in terms of modeling, if I'm modeling a session on how to change from the active to the passive voice, it might be before the session that I've made a little tutorial, and it need only be a 2-minute tutorial. And that can be the go-to place for anybody who's finding it a bit tricky during the lesson. So if I'm working with a group of children and Billy on the other side of the classroom doesn't quite understand question 2, his first port of call is to access that video tutorial. 9 times out of 10, that gets him back on track and he can continue to learn independently whilst I'm working with the group. Also offers the potential to share video stimulus as well. So when I was doing this lesson on the active and passive voice, we actually started with a clip from Ratatouille. So the children were automatically engaged, and instead of saying things like, you know, the rat prepared the meal, we were then changing that into a different voice. The meal was prepared by the rat, identifying where the subject, the verb, the object of the sentences were. And again, I can put that together in a little tutorial, and it just serves as a really good reminder for the children during the lesson. So it's almost like you've got that teaching input with you throughout the lesson to help you along the way. When it comes to practicing the skills, I was able to share all my lesson resources electronically. So I'd made a worksheet. The children had to rewrite the sentences in a different voice. I didn't need to photocopy anything. I prepared the worksheet that evening at home, bobbed it into Showbie, and that my lesson is set up for the next day. So when I come to school in the morning, I'm not photocopying. I'm not worrying about the cost of paper. I'm not worrying about the cost of ink. I'm not worrying about the time. It's all sorted. So it really is a more efficient way of working. In terms of the application composition refinement areas, the use of technology, this is where it had a really big impact on my practice. It enabled me to completely rethink the way that I taught writing, and particularly with a view to editing work. And we're going to unpick this in a bit more detail in a minute. So when we think about composition and the things that we're asking children to do, there is a whole range of different skills that we're asking them to put into a piece of writing, especially if any colleagues on the call are year 6 teachers, and we've got the framework in our head, and we want them to show all the things that we can tick off and say this child is meeting the expected standard, or maybe even the greater depth standard. So they're spinning a lot of plates when they're doing a piece of independent writing. So it comes as no surprise, therefore, when a couple of these plates start to drop. So at the end of that first draft, you can see that there's a few areas that you want the children to go back and improve, and the children will do this. And that's what the editing process is for, isn't it? We go back, we make these fixes, we make these amendments, we change a few things, and then we look to do our final draft, which we're going to put forward for our assessment, our assessed piece of work. Okay. So by doing this editing, it gives us the opportunity to pick up these plates that have fallen. Now, I've seen schools do this in many different ways. Sometimes schools will edit in the lesson. They may edit at the end of the lesson. They may do some editing at the start of the session with dedicated fix-it times. I know of some schools that I've worked with where they would do a piece of writing and they would spend a whole lesson editing it. And then they may edit their work with their partner. Now, one of the things that I found was that the more editing that children were able to do, obviously, the more improvements they're able to make to their work. So I just want to go through the model that I was using before technology had a big impact on my practice. And you may be familiar with this model, and it would be that the children would do a pencil draft of their assignment or their text. They would submit that then to me for feedback. I would give them a few pointers. Wouldn't be able to go into any great length in terms of the pointers because the time restrictions and marking year 6 writing does take a long time. They would then take on board my feedback and they would edit and look for some punctuation mistakes and things like that themselves. And then hopefully, if you've got time, we'll be able to do a beautiful handwritten or word processed final draft. Now, the advantage of doing that is that we would have a final piece of work for assessment. The disadvantage is that it's quite a lengthy process, particularly if the children are writing their first draft and then they're then going to have a go at writing their second draft in their neatest handwriting. So it can be quite a time-consuming process, really. Now, the alternative model, which I'm about to present to you, I'm going to come completely clean with and let you know it was a model that I stumbled across. It wasn't deliberate. This isn't any great kind of strategic thinking on my behalf. It basically came down to the fact that there was time constraints at the end of the term, and we were due to do a piece of Christmas narrative, and it was important as Year 6 teacher that we did some narrative because I wanted to incorporate dialogue that moved on the action and all those things that Year 6 teachers will be nodding and in agreement. We need to get some dialogue in there as Year 6 teachers. So I was unable to go through this whole process. So it was a case of, right, guys, we did the usual preparing, the rich immersion in the text type, looking at narrative. We did some skills development, making sure we know how to punctuate speech, making sure we can build up tension and have a sentence length variation, all these things that we would be expecting our Year 5, 6 children to be able to do in their writing. But instead of going through the whole drafting, I was running out of time. So I said, get your iPads out and just start typing away. So they just started typing their first draft on their iPad. Now, the way that we had the iPad set up, it meant that I could, through the Apple Classroom app, I could see what all the children were doing on their iPad. And it was a real eureka moment for me because I had all the children's screens on my iPad. And I could see what they were doing at the things that we do when we write emails and when we write reports. They were typing some sentences, they were going back, they were correcting things, they were adding vocabulary, they were changing things. Some of them were copying and moving whole paragraphs, and they were editing their work in a way which they had never done before. So by taking the editing process onto the iPad, instead of it being a handwritten first draft, we were able to see that by the time they finished that first draft, they'd been editing it all the way through. So the editing process wasn't at the start of a lesson or at the end of a lesson or an editing lesson. It actually became a really key part of the composition. And then we were able also to use some of the advances of the technology to improve that. So we could get the children to highlight their paragraphs and ask the devices to read back what they'd written. So, there's often a disparity between what the child has actually written compared to what they think they've written. So the opportunity for the children to listen to somebody read back to them what they had written individually with their headphones on, again, led them to improve their work. So this next slide, if I just go through, so at this point here, sorry, the only impact on this model is this word processed part here. On the alternative model, we started with the composition being in electronic format. So we're going to be drafting and fixing on the iPads or on the computers. And this was consistently going around in the lesson. Children were constantly going back and improving what they had done during the lesson, which is what they were not doing before. They would then submit their work electronically to me via Showbie. And one of the things that enabled me to do was not only I could annotate on the screen with a pen, I could provide some of those tutorials that I had used in preparing the skills for the session. So if there was a child who had not really shown any cohesion in their work, I could pull up a little tutorial that we'd used previously, looking at how we can achieve and put cohesion into our writing, and just say, have a look at the video. This is where your work is lacking. See if you can go back and add some cohesion between these paragraphs, maybe through some fronted adverbials, use of conjunctions, things like that. But the big advantage for me was the ability to leave verbal feedback. So where the children would have an opening paragraph, instead of just ticking, well done, look at a few spellings on this line, or look at the punctuation here, I was able to actually go into the nitty-gritty with a lot more detail and say, well done, this is a really good start to your story. I like the way that you've not told the reader all the information, you've kept something back, and that's helping to build suspense. One of the things that you might want to consider, where you've got all of this description, is maybe putting some dialogue in there to break up the description and maybe give you some information about the characters, which may come into the text a bit later. I wouldn't be able to write down that sort of feedback. It would just take too long. So to be able to give that verbal feedback, it was really, really valuable for the children. The way that we had it set up, we had a one-to-one iPad provision in year 5 and 6. When that feedback was given to the children, it would ping on their iPad. The children had their iPads at home. We allowed them to take them home. So at 4:30, their iPad would ping some feedback from the teacher about their narrative. They could then start thinking about how they could improve their work the following day. Some children would even start doing that at home, and they would have a go at maybe playing about with some of the suggestions or some ideas. You also had that idea at the end of the lesson where children, oh, I'm really getting to the interesting part. They could go home and continue that and bring that into school the next day. So some real benefits in terms of how we're using technology. Following the feedback, the children would continue writing their narrative, continue writing their explanation text, whatever it would be. They would respond to the feedback, hopefully improve their work. At that point there, we would print out what they had done. And we would double space it, we'd print it out, and the children would stick that into their book. And that would give them one final opportunity then, working on paper with their fixed-tip pens, to go into it and to improve it. So you can see the various different points of this process. Children are having multiple opportunities to edit and refine and to make good their work. And the final published piece of work, we actually did handwritten. So if you think back to the slide earlier where we're spinning all of those plates, we've got punctuation, sentence construction, voice, person, all those things that, all those demands that the children are facing when they're sat down to do a piece of independent writing. We've dealt with that now. Through this process here, we have dealt with that. So this final version almost becomes handwriting practice. It's just a secretarial task. And as a consequence, because they're freeing up their working memory and they can concentrate on their handwriting, we noticed that the standard of presentation had dramatically improved. So it was a really, really good model to use. So just in summary, more effective use of feedback, obviously increased engagement from the children. They could really jump into that first draft and get going with it. A lot of the children who had SEN found this to be particularly useful. So children who maybe their handwriting is a bit of an issue, children who are not confident in putting that pencil on the page, they've got far less fear doing it on screen because it's easy to delete. You're not rubbing out in your book, you're not crossing out in pen, and they're able, then they've got much more confidence, much more comfort to get on with it. Better use of time. You know, this kind of model evolved from a lack of time, and we were able to get the final draft finished, that the whole writing project was boxed off within 2 weeks. Substantially more opportunities for editing and refinement, pupils increased confidence, and also through the use of Showbie, we were able to use children's work as the model. So the lessons would often start with an example that a child had written the previous lesson, looking at areas that were worth celebrating, and then maybe areas the child could improve. And when the children could see their peers producing high quality work, high quality writing, it served as a real motivator for them to produce it themselves. So when we look at the impact of technology on this model, you can see we have moved on from it just being a word process, final draft publication to actually playing a really, really key part in the development of children's skills and their application in their compositions. So in terms of feedback, Showbie was the real change for us. It was the game changer. So we were able to give multimodal feedback. We were able to give children lots more specific, personalized feedback, the opportunity for voice notes where we could talk to them about their work, the opportunity also to share feedback across the group of children. So it might be that, you know, if you're doing a sentence level activity, let's take the example of changing the active to the passive voice. You could type in, well done, you've been successful doing this, you've got a good understanding of it. Copy and paste that. You know, you can do that for 80% of the class, the children who have got it. So you can imagine how much time that's saving. You know, it's really, really useful. Integration with other apps such as Socrative we'll come on to very shortly. Again, this idea of the use of tutorials. You know, you don't have to produce all of your own, you can find some online, but there could be something in that little video that you can put into that lesson folder, and that can be your go-to for your child. You could even put it in that folder before the lesson and really enhance the, you know, engage with the flipped learning model. Quite often we would do our topic work, if there's a video resource, instead of putting it into your lesson at the start of the lesson and, you know, 15 minutes of the lesson spent looking at that video, we would set it up in Showbie, and the homework was to watch the video and be prepared for the session. When we did our pupil feedback, actually, 80% of the children were saying that they'd watched the video more than once in preparation for the session. And then as a teacher, that really made me question my previous practice, whereby I'd shared video resources with my class, but I'd seen the video resource multiple times. I'd found it, so I'd seen it once. I'd seen it again to put it into my lesson. I'd seen it again just to double check there was no swearing in it and things like that. And then I would present it to the children. So I'd probably seen that video resource 4 or 5 times. I understood the content of that pretty well at that point. And then I would share it to my children at the start of my lesson, and they see it once. And then I'm expecting that they've extracted the same level of detail from that as I have, having seen it 4 or 5 times. So the opportunity to park that resource into Showbie for the children to watch before the session, opportunities for them to watch it multiple times, and then they come to the session prepared, ready to learn. So that 15 minutes that would otherwise be spent watching the video is spent discussing, evaluating, discussing it. You know, we think about Bloom's taxonomy and those high-level thinking skills, we can really get into the nitty-gritty of that resource. The ability to share pupils' responses was really great. Like I said, when pupils see each other succeeding, it serves as a motivation. And also parental involvement. So by downloading the Showbie app onto their mobiles, the parents are able to see what work the children are doing. They're able to see the feedback that you're providing, and they can support that learning. Now, there's obviously restrictions that you can put on what you want the parents to see and what you don't want the parents to see. You know, when I used it in my classroom, I was quite transparent. I was fine with that. Okay. Going on to the impact, I'm aware that there may be some teachers here who may think that they'd like to explore this further, and the self to their head teachers might not be, it just looks really good and I'm interested in it. We put in our one-to-one iPad provision, and Showbie played a big part of this in 2016. So just in terms of what happened to the writing data, colleagues of year 6 before 2015 will know that in 2016 we had the new interim, as it was, writing assessment framework coming there, and the demands were significant. So you will see nationally, which are the grey lines, there'll be a downward trend. But as the downward trend occurs nationally, where we've used iPad and where we've used Showbie and this new writing model, the data at the expected level, when I was at Nether Alderley, actually it increased. It was you know, above the national, and then a similar picture emerging at greater depth, where, you know, from the level 5 to the greater depth writing, it was a huge difference. But the impact on this was that from 2015, where we were below the national in both measures, you know, we went quite some way above the national. And obviously there's going to be the cohort factor here, but the trend remains the same. I left Nether Alderley in 2019, so I don't have the data from that cohort, and obviously COVID happened since then as well, but the data set is strong. So if there was ever an argument in terms of what is the impact on learning, then, you know, feel free to get in touch with me, and I'll point your head teacher in this direction. Another, just very quickly going to talk about spellings, really. Another thing that I felt technology really enhanced was pupil spellings. And again, I come back to Synec's why here in terms of the weekly spelling test. You know, why are we doing it? Why do we do weekly spelling tests? And it isn't for me so we can get more children scoring more full marks on a spelling test. We want children to learn how to spell, and we want them to be good at spelling. So we need to set this within the context of that why. We want children to learn to spell and to be confident spellers, to be better writers. So I devised a weekly test which was made up of 30 spellings each week. And I did this when I taught in year 3 and year 4, and I did this when I taught in year 5 and year 6. And the spelling test was made of 3 main lists. So we had the core, what I call the core list. Then we had the learn list and we had the focus list. So I'll just go through very quickly. The core list for the year 3-4 were the year 2 words, the key stage 1 statutory words. So it could be any 15 words chosen at random from that list. In year 5-6, it was the year 3-4 words. Again, chosen at random, 15 words. And the idea is that there are some tricky words in there. And just because a child moves on to a different class, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've got a full understanding of all of those spellings. So we're going to have to build in some repetition in here, some consolidation of those spellings. Now, if you're able to spell most of those words, you're pretty confident that you're going to be getting at least half marks on your weekly spelling test. But it just gives us an opportunity to revisit some of those tricky words that, otherwise we would assume that children know. The learn list will be 10 words, again, chosen at random. Now, what I would do in year 3 and 4 is separate the year 3-4 words into 3 separate lists. So I would have an autumn term, spring term, and a summer term. And likewise, I would do the same with year 5-6 words, autumn, spring, and summer. So I think there's about 90 words within these lists. So it turned out to be about 30 words a term. And because we were doing this in year 3 and year 4, when they started doing this in year 3, they would then have that repetition in year 4. And likewise, they would start doing the year 5 list in year 5, repetition in year 6. And then the remaining 5 words from this weekly spelling test would be 5 words from the rule that we were learning that week. So it might be prefixes, it might be suffixes, it might be double consonants, it might be I before E, all those type of words. So we made a planner where we put each week of the year, one lesson on the Monday would be looking at the spelling rule. So in this test, we would be looking at recapping words that we would otherwise assume we knew, but not necessarily the case. The words that the child is working on for that corresponding year group, and whatever that spelling rule is for that week. So it's quite a comprehensive package. So the way it would work, at the start of the term, we would do a baseline assessment of the core list. So the year 3-4s, we would test them on all the year 2 words. Year 5-6, we would test them on all the year 3-4 words. Now, we would use Socrative to do that, which we'll look at in a bit more detail. Socrative is now part of the Showbie family of apps. If you've not used Socrative or you're not familiar with it, I would urge you to do this, to look into it. I did all my spelling tests through Socrative and it had a profound impact. From that baseline assessment, we would then go into a free app called the A+ Spelling app, and we would produce personalized lists. So all the words that the child spelled incorrectly on that baseline, they would put into their list on their app. So the idea is that Sarah's list is going to be different to Bobby's list. It's going to be different to Janet's list. It's going to be different to Amir's list. It's going to be different to Sarah's list. So everybody is going to be working on practicing words which they find difficult. There is no point in practicing the words that you can already spell, and the words you can't spell just fall through the gaps. This is about personalized learning. Alongside that, we would also take the terminal learners. So as I was talking about this list we've got here, the 30 words or so, we would also put them into the app. So the child would have their list from the core, and they would have their learn list. And the advantage of this is that to do spelling practice, we could steal 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes every single day. And if you add up this amount of time, it does add up to quite an amount of time. So during registration, pupils would be spelling practice. When other children are doing some guided reading, pupils could have been doing spelling practice. We're coming from playtime at the end, after lunch, children are doing spelling practice. So we can buy these 5-minute pockets of practice time. I had emails from parents when we introduced this model saying, I've never known my child practicing their spellings as much as they're doing at the moment because of that engagement. It goes back to the why. We're engaging our children through technology. We're giving them hooks, which they're then going to put their learning on. Weekly Socrative test on a Friday. So I would pre-program the words in, and then I would use Socrative to test them. Now, the advantage of this is that I get live feedback. So during the test, I can see which words are causing problems. I don't have to collect in spelling books and mark them and then have a hunch that children were finding that word quite tricky. The data was bang in front of my eyes. So as soon as I close that spelling test, I've got 5 or 10 minutes before playtime. We're dealing with those 3 or 4 words which have caused particular problems. And then we can think of strategies that can help us to remember them. And then we can say to the children, next week's test, most of it is at random. but these are going to be, these 3 words will be repeated, so make sure you know these. So again, it's about using that assessment for learning. We're assessing their learning and we're doing something with it to help improve them and to help them to move on. Again, the immediate feedback, problem was identified, and then we could share all of that into Showbie as well. So it might be that on the back of the spelling test, I will then put into Showbie, each child will have a spelling folder in there, and I will put in, these were the problem words for this week. Make sure that you learn these ahead of next week, and that will be pinged out to all of the children, which was really, really useful. Now, one of the advantages of Socrative is that you can export the data as an Excel spreadsheet for your own records, but also you can produce a PDF of every child's response. So I would download a child's response and I would put their response into their Showbie folder. So the child can then see not only their scores from the test, but which spellings they got incorrect and which spellings they could practice and improve on. And some of the children actually in their own part made another list on the A+ spelling app, which was their personal problem list. And the ones that they spelt wrong, they would put into for their practice. Another benefit here was that when the PDF landed in Showbie, I gave parents access to that folder, so the children will get, the parents, sorry, will get a ping on their mobile phone. This is my child's spelling result. It doesn't say 27 out of 30, it gives them the PDF. So as a parent, I can see what spellings my child got incorrect, and I can support them with that aspect of their learning as well. This gives you an example of what you see using Socrative during a spelling test. So I'm getting this live feedback during the spelling test. I can see here, privilege is a problem. I'm going to deal with that. Straight after this test, I'm going to deal with that before the children go out to play and to start looking at building that. You can see this child here, red, 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 red. Okay, this child wanted to go ahead and do the full test. This child's targeting was just to do the core list because that's where they were at. So for some children, I would have said, you know, I want you to do the first 15, do the core list for me. Don't worry too much about the other spellings. We're not ready for that. But those children wanted to have a go at that. Nobody else is going to find out what they scored. They can do it on their iPad. It's all very private, and they can just do that if they wanted to. So again, it's an inclusive practice for them. But the ability to be able to draw this data in a live situation, really, really, really useful. And this is just an example here of what it looks like when you put the PDF. So I've got here all these previous spelling tests that the child has done, just a screenshot of what they can see from their PDF. So the child can see where their problem words are, the parent can see where their problem words are, and they can get cracking on improving these. Every child's going to have a different response. Every child is going to be working on their own words because we're on this very personalized learning journey. So at the start, it was all about looking at the why, and we wanted to engage, we wanted to inspire, and we wanted learning to be fun. And this has been the biggest shift for me in my teaching career, the use of technology and engaging pupils, not just in writing, but particularly in writing. So we started off with the why. I think we finish off with the why not. Thank you very much.
Hi Andy, thank you very much. That's been absolutely fascinating. I've been glued on every word that you've been bringing up. There's a couple of questions that have come through. One was around how you show progress of the work over time, following teacher feedback, and it would be great just to hear how you have used that.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, actually, because with my moderator's hat on, when people come and share their work, you know, teachers are very keen to share you the final draft with all the improvements and all of that. But with my moderator's hat on, I would be saying, okay, where's the evolution of this work? Where does it start with? So in terms of providing feedback, and what I would do with children at the end of every lesson is they would submit their work into Showbie. So it might be that, let's just say we're looking at a narrative, we're looking at story writing. They may have just done the opening, but they would screenshot that and they would share that in Showbie. And it might be that over the course as that writing evolves, we use the same folder. So if in terms of moderation, this was certainly the case when my pupils' work was being moderated, because, you know, moderators will want to look at how much, influence the teachers had in that. We don't want to be telling children, you've spelt this wrong, this is how you spell it, change that to this, because that's not independent, and as Year 6 teachers were aware of that. So what we actually had in the Showbie folder, if it was called a Christmas narrative, for example, we would have a whole body of work. So it would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and at each point you can see the evolution of that work. And you've also got access to the teacher feedback. So again, as a moderator, I am just making sure that the teacher's not giving them too much input regarding their work. And then you would have the printed off version at the end, which then goes into the book. So that really, in terms of where the book is, that final first draft would be the start in their books. Then the children would annotate and edit all of that before the handwritten task. But in the cloud in Showbie, you've got the evolution of this work coming through as they're drafting it through that process. Hope that answers your question.
So you're looking at the assignment timeline. So
Yes.
So you've got that, and you've got that dialogue in between each of the drafts. That's really, really powerful. And one of the things you just said was your moderator hat. So just there's another question come through that was specifically around moderation. How do you ensure that spelling and grammar remains independent? Because technology is fantastic. It's improved my spelling, that's for sure. But how do you deal with that with your children that you work with?
This is typically, these are the questions that I was asking myself when we started this journey. Really, is I need to be able to work in this way that I want to work, and which I think will really engage and inspire the children. But I'm also, there's a level of accountability to the framework as well. So quite simply, the way that we had our iPad devices set up, we were able to switch off the spellings and the grammar checks. So we were able to ensure that all the children's spellings and their use of grammar, it was their own work. And that's the thing, it's about, we're not trying to, cheat the system or pull the wool over anybody's eyes here. It's, we're quite happy to be open and transparent, and we want it to be right. And we don't want to put ourselves into a situation where by our use of technology opens us up to this kind of, these allegations. We need to make sure that we're doing it by the rules, if you like, if we're having moderated pieces of work. But quite simply, there's so many features within these devices, we just disabled the spell check, so the children don't get the wiggly lines and things like that.
So that's one piece of advice. If anybody is going to be new to technology, make sure you get the spell check turned off for your children.
Yeah. I mean, there was the first time we did the spelling test in Socrative, and one of the children, did probably be the snitch of the class, I guess. There's a red line underneath this one, so that kind of brought it swiftly to my attention that we had to get that switched off.
Yeah, and then just there was a bit where you talked about the expectation around the response to feedback and how children were responding to it at home. Was that an expectation, or was it voluntary, or just if you could talk a little bit more about that, that would be brilliant.
I think this really kind of encapsulates, when I talk about level of engagement, there was never any expectation that the children would do additional things at home. Their motivation for redrafting and improving and continuing their work at home was internal. It was completely upon them to do it. And they really engaged with it. So, whilst we were refining this model, children would maybe be doing some of the work handwritten in their book, and would come in with a paragraph they'd done at home, and they will print it off and stick it in their book and things like that. So yeah, it was voluntary. And one of the things that also I noticed, when I talked about the topic lessons and these are video resources, is that, to start the flips learning task, is that children started to appear with mind maps on their iPad. So they were using the Simple Mind app. There's lots of different apps you can use. But I noticed when we were starting these lessons with discussions, the iPads would come out with mind maps, and it was a case of what have you got there? And the children would say, well, I wanted to make a mind map to capture what I'd learned from the videos, because I knew we were going to be talking about it. And once one or two started doing that, again, it just spread like wildfire. So children were coming with their mind map. So it then became the discussion at the start, share your mind map with your partner. And so not everybody did it. Some children didn't do that, but they were happy to talk about what they'd learned from the resource. But that became part of the homework routine, watching the videos and things like that. And again, in terms of engagement, it was far more powerful. There was a really good one where there was an annotation about the Battle of Marathon. If you look it up on YouTube, it's fantastic. And it's a historian, he's forgotten more than I could know about the Battle of Marathon. Why are we not tapping into that expertise and sharing that with our children? So instead of them learning it from a, jack of all trades, master of none, me, they're getting access of a historian who's got it researched, who knows the details, who knows and can convey the excitement and all that kind of stuff, and really pass on that to the children. Why are we not making use of that? So it really did bring learning to life.
Yeah, and sticking with that kind of motivation, there was a question that came in around the spelling assignments, and is that something that you used all year round, so it become a journal, or was it just an individual assignment that got set each week to help maintain that that motivation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did two different things really. The main body, the organisation, if you like, of the spelling. Over the summer holidays, I produced a spelling document, and it was a bit painstaking, but it was worth it. So I would have the rationale behind all of this, and it wasn't about getting 30 out of 30. It was about learning how to spell, and things I've discussed already. But I would plan out the whole year. So I'd add I'd look at the calendar of the year, and I would say, right, looking at the national curriculum spelling rules, and I would put the spelling rules on each week, so I know that I've got all the spelling rules covered there. Then I would take what I call the learn list, so the statutory words for year 5, year 6. I would put them into 3 different groups. I've got my autumn group, the spring group, and I've got the summer group. And then I've got the revised list, the core list there as well. So when I started doing this in year 5, 6, I was just choosing it complete random. So I would choose words at random from those particular groups. So 15 from the year 3, 4 list, 10 from this term's year 5, 6 list, and then 5 from the spelling rule we were doing that particular week. And all of this was outlined in one document. So it's quite a comprehensive document. And again, I just bob that into Showbie, and all they've got access to it. So you've not got, I've lost my spelling journal. I don't know what's on the spelling list, what the focus list is next week. It's all there. When I moved into year 3 and 4, feedback from parents was that it was good, but there were too many words for them to be learning randomly. So I would just, again in Showbie, I would give them a week's prior notice to say, these are the words, and I would still work with words from those different lists, but I would share with them on the Friday what the words will be for the following Friday. So they had a week to focus on those particular words. And that was my kind of compromise with the parents, because a few parents were saying, we don't think it's fair, they're not getting as good scores, and trying to shift their mindset that, the why isn't to get a good score in a spelling test and then never spell these words correctly in 3 weeks' time when you've forgotten because you were just learning them for that Friday, and all I wanted to do was get a spelling test. It was all about being able to revisit these words, which is why we did it for a term, have those words for a term, because over the course of that term, those words were coming up 4, 5, 6 times in the spelling test. So it gave them a bit of motivation. That was the kind of accountability factor. But when the children were using these words in their independent writing, boy, did we celebrate that as well.
Yeah. So with that, were you using voice notes, or was it typed out so they could see the spelling, or when you were sharing those word lists?
When I was sharing the word lists, I would type them out so they could see which spellings they were going to be tested on, and they were there as well, so they could use that as a way to I could have used the voice notes, couldn't I? Didn't think
yeah. So and then I presume when you were doing that live, you were using Apple Classroom and locking them into an app so they couldn't just nip back into Showbie to double check.
So as soon as we're in Socrative, that they would be locked into Socrative for the spelling test. And again, you can see the live feedback. If Bill is taking a bit longer to spell the words every time, suspicions might be raised a little bit.
Yeah, brilliant. So there's no other questions that have come through. So I suppose it's a case of speak now or forever hold your peace. Thank you to everybody who's joined us. So there's a couple of people who dropped off because they've got lessons to teach. Thank you very much. There will be a recording going out of this and for you to watch back, share with colleagues. And I would just like to say thank you, Andy, for giving up your time this morning, because I know the pressures that you'll be under being a head teacher now. So thanks again, and thank you to everybody who's attended and everybody who's watching this recording. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. And if anybody, my email's on the slide at the front, if anybody wants to get in touch, any questions, obviously, Graham is the oracle, but if there's anything that I can help you with, by all means, give us a shout.